When I was a little girl, I used to love fairy tales. Snow White, Beauty and the Beast, Cinderella, it was my favorite. I was always encouraged how they would take something so broken and it would end up so beautiful. Well, as I've gotten older, I've come to realize life is not a fairy tale at all. It's very real. But you know, God can take our brokenness and He can make something so very beautiful. So join me as we explore chapter by chapter stories of faith, determination, and courage of people that you may very well know. You may not think you do, but we all have a story to tell. My name is Sue McDonald, and this is my story. One of my earliest memories is when my mom and dad divorced and how that affected all of us so bad. And ironically enough, all the kids stayed with my dad. And I remember as we pulled out of the driveway, my mom. I remember my mom standing on the steps as we were in the back of the station wagon. And I remember her standing on the steps on the little stoop, waving goodbye to us. And that was tough. So my dad took us and we moved in with his parents. And we went from Tennessee to Illinois. And I was a daddy's girl. And so we lived with his parents for a little while until he was able to kind of get on his feet and get a house. And so quickly, stayed there with them, and then we moved into a house of our own, and things were going good. And I remember a little short period of time, honestly, a very happy time of him and my mom trying to get back together, and that lasting for just a little short stint. And then when they separated that time, she took the girls, and he kept my brother. And that's when we ended up in 1976 moving to Kentucky, and we moved down on the farm down past Crane. And I have lots of fun memories of growing up there. I lived basically with my grandparents, and so I have lots of fond memories of that. And I was in first grade, I think, when we moved there, and that was the big winter. You hear people talk about the winter of 76 or 77, whatever it was, and that was the huge snow that we got here. And I can remember fun times out on the farm during all that. And I remember when family would come, and of course you were at grandma's, and so when the holidays would come around, all of the cousins and everybody would come and stay, and there was a lot of us. And for me, it was my home. That's where I lived, on the farm. But for all the cousins that came that lived in bigger cities, it was a big deal. And I can remember literally Grandma and Grandpa gathering us all up in the wagon, and we would go down to the creek, and they'd shoo all the cows out of the creek, and we'd take baths and stuff because we didn't have running water. And so money wasn't readily available when I was growing up, but love very much was. My grandmother and my grandfather was very very, very loving. And my mom was going through some tough stuff, and she wasn't at home a whole lot. She was preoccupied with some things in life. And I don't sit here and when I think about my life and when I think about my story, I don't blame any negative thing really on anybody. It's just, I think we've all been handed something in life that we have to make choices, and not all of us make the right choices. I've not always made the right choices. So when you hear me talk about, when my mom wasn't around, my mom did the best that she knew to do with the information that she had been given. She went through a lot of struggles, and so she wasn't around for a lot of that time. And so we ended up, again, living with my grandparents. And when I said that all the girls had went with my mom, my oldest sister didn't stay for very long, and she ended up going and living back with my dad. And so it was just Linda and I. Pretty much all my life, my mom was a waitress, and so Linda would always make sure, even though she was just 17 months older than I was, she would make sure that we'd get up for school and we got everything together, and she'd get us out the door for school, and gosh, all the way up until in high school. I mean, Linda made sure that I had my lunch money because I was notorious for forgetting all of that, and she was just like a second mama, to me. I remember when I was 8 years old, and our grandparents made sure that we were in church every time. Every time the doors opened. And Grandma made sure that we were there. Grandma and Grandpa were involved in church. And when I was 8 years old, I can remember vividly, right here in Crane, standing on a little stoop outside of my grandma's house, and I always pretended that I was married to a preacher. We were doing a revival, or we were doing something, and I was singing, and then I would sit down and pretend like he was preaching, and we were leading people to the Lord. I remember doing that at 8 years old, and so whenever I thought about what did I want to be when I grew up, I just always wanted to be a preacher's wife. I wanted to be a pastor's wife, and not having any kind of clue what that meant, but just mimicking what I had seen. Gosh, you fast forward a few years, and my mom, she ended up marrying a gentleman, and we moved to town, and I was in fourth grade at that time, and you think life's going to be great. We're moving to town, and now I remember the day I asked that man if I could call him my dad, and he said yes. And so then, I had two dads. I didn't get to go and be with my real dad very often, except for maybe a week or two in the summer and, some holidays, not very often. And so there was something inside of me, even at that age, I remember just longing to have a man in my life, longing to have a daddy figure. So I remember being excited about now having a dad that was going to be there all the time. And so I found myself clinging to him, and he was very good to us girls. He really was. But what we didn't know was he struggled with alcohol, and that consumed a huge part of his life. And by that time, my mom had started going to church, and we would go as a family, and from the outside looking in, we looked like the model family. But on the inside, that what a lot of people didn't know about was the struggles that we were dealing with Dad being an alcoholic, my mom still struggling with some of her issues of not knowing what she wanted in life or anything, and then you had, two teenage girls who were sometimes just flat out rebellious. And I can only speak for myself. I can't speak for Linda, and so I found myself doing a lot of things that I'm not proud of, but I was still I would go to church, and I would still sit there and I would listen to my pastor, and long to live for God. I found myself one time as a teenager hanging out with some friends that I shouldn't have been hanging out with, and I found myself running from the law, and I'll never forget getting pulled over, finally getting stopped and getting pulled over, and when the police officer walked up to the car, it was my Sunday school teacher. And I thought, I can't outrun God. I can't get away from him. And instead of going to jail that night, I got escorted home and got a pretty good reprimanding from him and from my parents and from the pastor. And like I say, everything in me wanted to live for God. I'd be like, okay, I'm gonna go to church. I'd find some friends that I could go to church with and things like that. And I always needed somebody close in my life to love me. My mom was very busy. My dad was struggling with his own struggles. And then my mom and my stepdad, when I believe I was a sophomore in high school, when they divorced. And then again, they tried to get back together. And then I think I was a senior in high school or something I think I was a senior in high school when they split up again. And so I just found myself consuming my time with other people and always looking for that. And I just wanted some sort of stability in my life. With my dad, my stepdad, I call him my dad because he was a daddy to me. And when my stepdad was dealing with his struggles of drinking, I can remember as a young girl whenever we would have people come over to the house and stuff, and I was always embarrassed of all the beer and the things that were in the refrigerator or stashed in different places. And I always had said to myself, I'll never marry an alcoholic. I'm never going to marry anybody that my children are going to have to be. I'm not going to live my life in such a way that my children are going to be ashamed of anything that I've done or embarrassed or anything like that. And so I knew that when the time came that I wanted to get married, I had certain stipulations. And that was really hard because I sure wasn't living my life to want anybody to desire me that was living, I guess, a godly life would be the only way to put it. When I got a little older, probably 17, 18 years old, I met a gentleman who treated me so kind. And I don't think I'd ever even seen anybody be so kind to a woman. I'd never seen that. And it was just really odd to me. And it was very scary at the same time. And so that relationship, as good as he was to me, that relationship didn't last very long because I just ran. I don't know. I think it was about 7 months went by, and I just had, I don't know. I don't know what it was. I really don't. I wanted that person in my life. And so I went looking for him. And lo and behold, we weren't together very long, and we got married. And I can remember standing on the steps of the church the day that we got married, and my dad, it's my stepdad, he's actually the one who walked me down the aisle, and he asked me if I was ready, if this was really what I wanted to do. And shamefully enough, I looked at him and said, worst case scenario, we just get a divorce if it doesn't work. And I did the one thing I never said I would do, and that was marry an alcoholic. He was an alcoholic. And he drank from the time he got up till the time he went to bed, and it was tough. And to say that our first few years of marriage were rough is an understatement. I think we were married 4.5, 5 years when our daughter was born. And I don't know. I just lived in a fantasy world. He had been raised by his mom and dad, who had always been married, and didn't come out of a divorced family. And I came out of a divorced family of just, I guess, again, the word dysfunction. And I just had a fantasy of what I wanted it to be. I had a fantasy of what I expected a husband to be, had a fantasy of what I expected a daddy to be. I had a fantasy of what I expected marriage in general. And everything to me was just a fantasy, just living in a fantasy. So during those first 7 years of our marriage, he worked away. He, when we first met, he was a core driller, so he would be on the road all over the country. And then he ended up working on a towboat, and he was gone. I guess out of the first 9 years we were married, we really only lived together about 4.5, and so, that was pretty stressful. And I just figured that I could have my fantasy life with somebody else, and so I was very adamant on I will not cheat on my husband. But I always had the other option. I could just get out, and so I'm not going to cheat because that's not right. I watched how that had played out in people's lives in generations before me, and that wasn't pretty. But just stopping and getting a divorce, that's it's a clean cut, and we can move on. And that's the way I looked at it, and so that was my plan. And so I called him. He was on the boat one day, and I just called him and said, listen, me and Aaron aren't going to be here when you get home, and I just don't want to live like this anymore. I don't know that I even had a good excuse. I don't know that I had a good reason. I didn't want to do that no more. And he asked me to stay home at least until he got home, and we could talk about it and come up with a plan. And so that's what we did. And in that plan, there was a lot of fighting. There was a lot of raised voices. But really, we didn't want to quit. I can sit here and say that I truly, truly loved him, and he was good to me. I think I had set him up for failure. From that moment, we decided we're gonna try to make it work, and that's what we did. Because I had always been in church with my grandmother as a little girl, and then with my mom, as crazy as our life was with my mom and my stepdad, we went to church all the time, and so everybody thought that I was the one who had it all together. And so about 4 years into our marriage, Chris decides he wants to go to church. And I'm like, okay, let's go. And I wanted to talk about it. I wanted to talk about future plans. And I wanted to have him pray, and he didn't even know how to pray, and that was a shock to me. And he said, I don't even really know how to do that. And so I led us in prayer that night, and we went to church the next day. And I'll never forget when the preacher started preaching. You would have thought that he was sitting in our bedroom the night before and quoting some of the exact same things that we had said that night. And it was almost scary. I had no idea about hearing the voice of God, and like God using someone to really speak to you in that way. But long story short, Chris goes down to the altar. He gives his heart to God. And the one thing that I could say about Chris McDonald is when he makes a decision to do something, he sticks to it. That's just who he is. And he gave his heart to God that day. And he was committed that he was going to live for God. And I think his only hang-up at that point was me. It's hard trying to be somebody that you're not. And I was trying to pretend to live a godly Christian life when I hadn't even given my heart to God in the first place. And that is a whole story in itself. But as a very, very young little girl, I went to the altar with a bunch of other kids. And I can only speak for myself and what was going on in my mind at the time. When I was 6 years old, I'm doing it because everybody else is doing it, and I don't want to be the only one left sitting in the back by myself. and let's just hurry up and get this done and I can move on. And so I went through the motions, but I never accepted Christ into my heart. In that fighting process, in that his idea of we're going to make it work, for the first time in my life, true conviction came. I remember hearing God's voice for the first time. And what I didn't know then, but I know now as Scripture, is that gentle knock. And him calling me. And I would question all the time. I wanted now, all of a sudden, now I wanted to believe what I had known for years was a lie, but surely I'm saved. I know, I went to the altar. So now all of a sudden, I'm arguing with God. Well, I know I'm saved because I went. But yet, I knew that I never asked Christ to come into my heart. And so I struggled with that because I was the one that everybody thought had it all together. I was the one who was calling friends and going to church and acting the part. And if I give my heart to God now, I'm going to have to tell somebody. And I can't do that because people are going to judge me because I've been living a lie for so long. And so I struggled. And I mean, when I say I struggled, like I was physically sick for quite some time just trying to struggle through that. And I would talk to Chris about it a little bit, and he only knew what I'd said, that I went down to the altar before. And so I finally told him, I said, but I haven't told you all of it. Like when I went to the altar, I wasn't for real there. And so one night laying in bed, I made a decision that I would give my heart to God. And it was on a Tuesday night. And I said, but Lord, if you'll let me live for the next 24 hours, I'll do it publicly. I'll do it at church tomorrow night in front of everybody. I got up the next morning, with a new purpose in my heart. Like I was going to go to work, and then I was going to go to church, and I was going to give my heart to God, and everything was going to be great. And I remember on the way to work that day, I went around a curve, and a huge truck was on my side of the road. And I screamed out, and I said, God, let me live. And the truck got back on its side of the road, and I went to work, and I just remember thinking, I got to get to church, because I got to do it in front of everybody. That's what I told God I'd do. And I don't think that that's true. And but then that's what I thought. And so we went to church that night. We were having Bible study, and as soon as it was over, I went to the pastors and I said, I need to talk to you. And I did, and I was honest, and there was no shame, no judgment. And I gave my heart to Christ that night. And 1998 is when that was. And I'll never forget the excitement that Chris had. And from that point on, everything changed. That longing that I always had, even from an 8-year-old girl, I could now start fulfilling that. I could now start living that dream out, because the 8-year-old girl who always wanted to be married to a preacher, who never wanted to be married to an alcoholic, but got married to an alcoholic anyway. But now me and my husband were both living right, and there was some sort of a chance that we could make it. When I think about how has our life changed since coming to know Christ and giving our hearts to Christ, oh my goodness. I'll have to just like fast forward everything. We started living our life for Christ, and we just really dove into the Word. I mean, we were in the Word all the time. Chris got a Strong's Concordance, and he was constantly digging in that. We were listening to cassette tapes constantly of preaching. We were watching preaching continually on the TV. Then, you didn't have a lot of channels, and Erin was just a little girl, and she was fighting to watch her little kids shows, and Chris was fighting to watch preaching all the time. And but God was really working some things out in both of us. And Erin was still just very, very young, but God was working some things out in both of us. We were finding out about marriage, and we were finding out about being a husband and a wife, loving God, and that become our common ground, is we both wanted to live for God. And so it wasn't even about being a good wife or being a good husband. It was, I want to live for God, and that was really both of our goals at that point. And so the more we did that, and we teach that a lot of times now, even in premarital counseling, if both of you are just going toward God, you're going to get closer. You're going to find each other. And I think that's what Pastor Chris and I did. We were constantly striving to find God, and the more we looked for God, the more we found ourselves with each other. And so we, at that point, like I say, we were going to church all the time, and I knew that something was going on with Chris and his calling. And he would sit in church, and his leg would shake the whole time. He couldn't stay still. He was fidgeting constantly, and I knew he wasn't on no drugs or anything like that. But I mean, the power of God would get all over him so strong, and I could just watch his wheels turn when the pastor was preaching and things like that. And it was different. It was truly different. And God had spoken to me and said he's going to preach the gospel. And I instantly went back to the 8-year-old girl. And I was excited. But I wasn't going to tell Chris, because I didn't want to be the one to call Chris to preach. I wanted Chris to know that God was calling him to preach. And so I never said anything. And one Sunday, we came in from church, and I was fixing some lunch, and he came around the corner, and I'll never forget it. And he said, "We need to talk." And I said, "You're right, we do." And he goes, "Well, you don't know what I'm going to talk to you about." I said, "I think I do." And we kind of went back and forth there a little bit. And he said, "Well, then what do you think it is?" I said, "Nope, go ahead and say it, because I'm not going to be the one to tell you." And he said, "Well, I think I'm supposed to preach the gospel." And I said, "I know you're supposed to preach the gospel." And so from that point on, everything changed. Our journey changed. And but I didn't know what any of that meant, just that he was going to preach the gospel. And if it went like my vision did when I was an 8-year-old girl, he was going to preach, I was going to sing, and we were going to win lots of people to God. It was that simple to me. And at just the right time, Life in Christ Church was dedicating their building, not the one we're in now, but the old building. They had just built it, and there was a guest speaker coming. Pastor David Brown was coming from Amarillo, Texas, and he was going to dedicate the building, and he was also going to talk about his ministry over in Honduras and stuff like that. And so we came and we sat in those services, and everything in our world changed. Chris McDonald knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was called to preach to the nations. We prayed every day, asking God what it is you want us to do. And long story short, we ended up going to Amarillo at that time. That was in 2003. And just serving at that church there, and learning ministry, learning all the ins and outs of ministry, but never, our radar was not on pastoring, I can tell you that. And not even a blimp in our radar. And so we stayed out there for 5 years, and then they asked us to come back and pastor Life in Christ Church. I also remember at a women's conference that Life in Christ had, and Connie Brown was preaching. We were all over at the lakes at a resort over there, and she was preaching, and she was talking about a bulldog tenacity. And she was preaching about the Shunammite woman and how she wasn't going to quit until she got what she came for. And that woman went to the man of God believing for what God had spoken to her all those years before about her son. And so as she was preaching that message, I remembered God speaking to me what I then now knew, as God speaking to me as an 8-year-old girl about being a pastor's wife, and how you don't quit until you get what you came for. And just believing that God was going to finish what he started. And I remember sitting in that conference thinking, God's going to finish what he started. God's going to finish what he started. And the next thing I know, she's praying for people, and I'm standing in front of her, and she looks at me and she says, I want you to know that God's going to finish the work that he began in you, and he's going to bring it around to full completion. And for the first time really in my life, I believed that God had a plan for my life, a future and a hope for that 4-year-old girl who was in the back of that station wagon, and for that 8-year-old girl who was standing on the stoop of her grandmother's house. Even then, God had a plan for my life. And as much as I tried to get it off track, and in everything that I did in my own fantasy world to make it all go astray, God brought it all back together, just like his word says. I will complete that work that I began in you. When I now look at my husband, Pastor Chris, and listen to him teach the word the way that he does, I can sit here and say that I wouldn't be who I am today without his teaching and his preaching in my life. He has taught me to be a stronger me. He has truly brought out the best in me. I think just like with me, he is with so many other people. He's my best cheerleader. He's my biggest encourager. And he helps keep me, keeps me grounded. When my flesh wants to get flighty, he pulls me back around. Whether it's just by his encouragement or whether it's through a message. And I wouldn't be who I am today without Pastor Chris. Not just my husband, but without Pastor Chris. And teaching the truth of the word. Because with all the things that I'd been through my life, fear, anxiety, the spirit to roam, he has brought the word into my life in such a way that fear doesn't have a chance. Anxiety is truly dead to me. And faith has been brought to the forefront. And it's with the faith that he's taught me about that I can push all that stuff aside. And I don't have to live in the past, that I know my best days are ahead of me. I'm Sue McDonald, and that is my story.